Hey everyone, welcome to today's edition of One Single Story. I am with Pastor Jay Rivenbark, Pastor Zack Unkenholz, and we are finishing up our conversation this week on the book of Job. The theme in the book of Job is blessings through sufferings, and today we're going to look at Job chapter 38. So we've jumped quite a piece of it, and I believe this is the first time God speaks in chapter 38. So far, it's been Job complaining and his friends complaining, and he's defending himself against Job. And it says, "Then the Lord answered Job from the whirlwind, 'Who is this that questions my wisdom with such ignorant words? Brace yourself like a man, because I have some questions for you, and you must answer them. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Tell me if you know so much. Who determined its dimensions and stretched out the surveying line? What supports its foundations? Who laid its cornerstones? As the morning stars sang together and all the angels shouted for joy." So God just begins to ask Job all of these rhetorical questions like, how are you? Who do you think you are? Mm-hmm. So the kind of the two-pronged question that I want to dive into today is, what right do we have to question God, and what is God's response? Go ahead, ask him, Zach. Jay, what do you think?
Jay, what do you think? Jay, what are your thoughts on this?
Defer it. I'll be glad to take it.
I was just gonna say, I think in verse 3, the two scariest words that God says in all of Scripture: "Brace yourself." That's terrifying. If God said that to me, I'd be like, "Oh my goodness, what have I done?"
What was it Arnold Schwarzenegger said?
I don't remember.
In the Terminator movies?
I would be back.
Yeah.
Or, I don't know.
Maybe, I think that's right. Yeah.
I have not seen Terminator 2, which I know is the good one.
I have not seen any of them.
So. Oh, really? Dang. What? Oh my gosh.
Said, what?
We're all going to watch anime after this and watch Terminator.
Daniel, have you watched Terminator? Oh.
Yes. Ooh, okay. Daniel,
we're not all watching anime. That's a fact.
Have you seen the Terminator anime? I'm just joking. Anyways, but
what was the question again?
You asked it. I think the question was, do we have a right to question God, and what is God's response to our questioning? I think it's, as Christians, I think if we have no questions for God, if we never have doubts, I think that's almost concerning, right? If we're just like, I think it's natural for us to have questions and to sometimes, I think like part of growth is that we have questions and we want answers, and will we always get the answer or even the answer that we want? Not necessarily, but I think it's so important that we, as just growing people, that we continue to have questions for God. Now, to question God, I think that's also part of any relationship. I think that we question one another, and I don't think it's healthy to always be in that state. I think it's a natural part of the relationship that we have with God, is that sometimes we do have questions for him and we question him. But also, too, I think God answers it differently than here. I don't think any of us have had an experience where God is like, put us on blast, like has really, like gone after us and been like, you're about to see, like.
For all the old people listening,
yeah,
explain to them what put on blast means.
Well, typically put on blast means like, it's like it's to make it known to a lot, like, so by having this in Scripture and like calling Job out, he is putting Job on blast. It would be like if I was to like call out Steve on never watching Terminator, like on Facebook, I'd be putting him on blast, and so God is essentially in front of the audience of the millions and millions of billions of people who have read Scripture. He's putting him on blast in front of all these people to make an example of Job, but also use Job as an example, in a good way, in some ways. And so I think that we do have a right to question. I think we can question God, but I also think too is that we shouldn't always be questioning God. I think sometimes we do just have to trust in him and have faith.
I actually think I heard you say it in a message this way. It's okay to ask God questions. It's not okay to question God. And there's a difference. Mm-hmm. If you're having a conversation, you're naturally going to ask questions because you're trying to understand. To question God is to question his sovereignty, his authority, his ability, those things that are beyond our capabilities. I do think being able to ask God honest, open questions is a sign of a healthy relationship. I think he appreciates and values that. A couple things to be said. We got to be prepared for the answer. If he does answer those to a way that we think.
When he puts us on blast.
He puts us on blast. Or if he doesn't answer those, our faith still has to be intact. But to ask God questions and to question who God is are two different approaches, two different things.
Could you give an example of the difference between asking questions and questioning God?
Well, I think it's something as simple as, let's say I'm going through a crisis or suffering season. Hopefully it doesn't look anything like Job's. But to ask questions of God, did I contribute to this? If so, would you help me see it so I can take steps to correct this? I'm willing to take ownership if it's something I've contributed to. Whereas to question God, I think would be to say, like, this isn't fair. How dare you? You're
who do you think you are?
Who do you think you're mistreating me? I belong to you, and yet you let me go through this. I think to question God ultimately is to challenge his character and his holiness and his sovereignty, whereas to ask questions is to genuinely want.
Yeah, and even how we ask them.
Sure.
I think it was off air today. Sometimes Zach was explaining to us how you can, how you say something.
Oh,
No, I'm not asking you to repeat it.
Okay.
I'm not asking you to repeat it.
No.
How you say something, it changes how it's received.
Well, let's say
perceived.
Like, you're crazy versus you're crazy.
Well,
like that,
so-
completely changes.
so I think
what it means.
If I was to walk up to Jay and I say, "What are you doing?" I think he would receive it, and explain to me what he was doing, if he was in the middle of something. But if I said, "What are you doing?" That's received completely different because the question
different.
is an accusation. It's an accusation framed as a question. Like, you're wrong. Explain yourself.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes we come to God questioning, genuine heart. God, what are you doing right now? What is it? I think that's okay. What is you? But when we say, what are you doing?
Yeah.
We're accusing him of not knowing what he's, supposed to be doing. And I think that's perceived differently in human relationships, because when we frame questions as accusations, God, can't you see this isn't fair? Who's determining that? I don't think it's a problem questioning God, and I don't think God is ever required to respond. He takes a long time to respond to Job. Job is a long book.
Yeah.
There's a lot of words before God ever decides to speak.
Yeah, and I think it's a valid point to touch on is that, early on in this process, there was a long period of silence, period.
Mm-hmm.
His friends show up. There's a long period of silence before they get off track with him. And it's even longer before he hears from God. And I think it is in those seasons of pain, anguish, suffering that the longer it is before we do hear from God, I think the greater the tendency for us to question God or who he is or what's up with the situation. And I think it bears in mind we need to be careful about that.
Because even if in this specific story of God allowing Satan to test him, with this, if God immediately after, God was like to say, like, surprise, this is a test, and it wouldn't have meant anything really, if he didn't have that opportunity to actually be challenged, it would have been all for naught,
Yeah, I will hear people, leaders from time to time, and they will say, you're not obligated to answer everybody's questions. there are some people, if they question you, you're obligated to answer them. But like you should just ignore. If you get an email from X person, you're under no obligation to respond to that. In my opinion, the only time God is obligated to respond to me is when I'm repenting. You know, the scripture says, if we confess our sin, he's faithful and just to forgive us our sin. Outside of that, I don't think he's obligated to even give us an explanation. Yeah. You know, not even to say, wait. You know, and because there are a lot of times in scriptures where they don't even get because if Job knew in the end that he was going to get double back, you know, there's this great skit. I don't know why it just popped in my mind, from John Crist and what's the other big Christian comedian?
Tim Hawkins.
Tim Hawkins. Have you seen them together?
No, I haven't.
Talking about the story of Job. Oh my goodness, it is hilarious. John Crist says, how bad must have Job? He said, how bad a person must Job's wife have been? He's like, because all of the things that God took from him, he left her. Anyway, it's just this hilarious. She's the only thing God didn't destroy. But it's funny just to listen to him. But if you know, we read the book of Job, and I'll hear people talk about the end. Like, if you know at the end, this is how it's going to turn out. You're like, okay, I can handle this. I think earlier, that's right, I can handle it. You know, I mean, if I put money in the stock market and I know it's got to go down 75% before it's going to double 6 months later, but I know it's going to double 6 months later, I can ride that out. You know,
and not panic in the process.
That's right, not freak out. But when everything is disappearing and I don't know, and we don't know. And we want God to answer, because those are the questions we want. God, how's this going to turn out? Because I think if we could get that, how's this going to turn out?
If we could get the assurance part,
we would be. But don't we already have that assurance?
We do. I'm not sure that we necessarily believe that, or we tend to lose focus of that, you know, when we're in the process.
Yeah, when we're in the
that
middle
ultimately
of it.
Heaven's our home, you know, resurrected body, all the joys and bliss that go with the whole 9 yards, you know, but we lose sight of that in the process.
Well, it's kind of like with the disciples. Before Christ died, they had been told that he was going to return. Right. You know, like multiple
he was
times.
going to rise again.
Yes, very clearly.
Forget the return part.
Yeah.
He was coming. Right. They only had to wait 3 days.
Yes. And they panicked and they hid and they were like, you know, and they lost all hope. I mean, really. And
they didn't even believe him when he walks through the door.
That's
like he don't even open the door. He comes in and they still don't, like, they're still doubting.
And for us, we're on the other side of that, and that we know that all this has happened, right? And yet even still, like you were saying, like even still, there are times when like I'm like, I know what Christ has done for me. I know that he rose again. I've been able to see scripture and read scripture and understand what God has done. And yet even still, I don't always have trust in God. And that's a sad thing, but it's a thing that, like, call it human nature, call it what you will, one of our weaknesses, I guess. But that even still, when we're in the middle of it, it's hard to see God, even when so clearly we can see what he's done in the past.
When are you most likely to question God?
I think when I believe God has pushed me in a certain direction, like God has called me to something and it just fails, like, miserably, or it does not go the way I expected. And maybe it was because initially I just thought to myself, oh, like, this must be God's will. But when I think God wanted this for me and then it doesn't work out, that's when I'm like, what happened? You know, I typically try to blame myself before I blame God or question him, but that can rock me.
For me, it would be similar to Job's story in that the longer the process goes, the harder it is. And I think I'm being completely transparent and honest here when I say I don't think it's a question for me that I believe and trust God or His sovereignty, but not necessarily that it's going to work out for me in a way that I
At
want
least
it.
here on this earth. the
Yeah,
way
that it's
you
going to
want it
recover. Yeah, and the second part to that answer would be the story of Job, and I think we often miss this. He lost all those things, and he recovered, quote, twice as much in the end. But his children were replacements; they weren't recoveries. And so
They weren't originals. Yeah.
that's exactly right. There are some things that are near and dear to us that we lose in this life that we probably aren't going necessarily to get back.
We won't. Yeah.
Some things are blessed. Some things wind up twice as good in that process. Some things aren't recovered, and we have to understand that sometimes that is the way life is, and we just have to buckle down and say, God, I don't like it, don't understand it, but I'd love and trust you.
Yeah, he might have had 6 good kids to start with and ended up with 12 hellions.
Yeah, because we don't know. We're not told
Little
that
terrorists.
Yeah. The times that I'm most likely to question God are one when I have zero, and I probably have a lot less control than I think I do most of the time. But when I feel like I have zero control of it, like there's nothing I can do.
Yeah.
I didn't cause it. I can't fix it, but I got to deal with it.
Yeah.
That situation. And the second time is when I feel like I have to speak for God. As a pastor, pretty much everything I say, people feel like I'm speaking on behalf of God. It can be as simple as building a building or buying a van or starting a new program. Did God speak to you about this? I'm most likely to question God in those moments, because I want to be sure, because I don't want to lie on His behalf, and
Good point.
so those are the two places that I would. Well, thank you for joining us this week on One Single Story. I hope that you will be back with us again on Monday as we examine a new theme from a new book of the Bible, and we'll talk to you then.